There is a time for everything and a season for every activity under the heavens, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot, a time to kill and a time to heal, a time to tear down and a time to build. We've had a lot of history today, and while there is regret about the closure of our precious Heythrop, I want to use the next 45 minutes as a time for reflection, to try and look forward and to draw a little bit on the past history, but I want to try and read the signs of the times, which is the title I gave to Simon. In Matthew's Gospel, Jesus says, when evening comes, you say the weather will be fair, for the sky is red. And in the morning, today it'll be stormy, for the sky is red and overcast. You know how to interpret the appearance of the sky, but not the side of the times. A previous general of the Jesuits, Pedro Arrupe, had a prayer, grant me, O Lord, to see everything now with new eyes, to discern and test the spirits that help me read the signs of the times, to relish the things that are yours, and to communicate them to others. Give me the clarity of understanding that you gave Ignatius. And I think one of the things that the Jesuits should be incredibly proud of, starting with Ignatius, is the ability to read the signs of the times, to understand the culture in which they are operating and to respond to it. Ignatius formed the society at a particular time. It was a time when the Reformation in Northern Europe was gaining ground. The Bible had been translated into local languages that many people could read, and there was a real threat, if you like, put it in those terms, in the northern half of Europe from the Protestant Reformation. And yet the Jesuit emphasis is on education, and is a proud record of schools across the world and also universities. And universities with all that means in terms of open-minded commitment to academic excellence. But it wasn't only in education. The record of Jesuits over the years in science has been really quite extraordinary, in almost every field. To an extent in physics, to an extent in chemistry, certainly in a very major way in mathematics, a bit in paleontology, but astronomy absolutely central. I wonder how many of you know that 36 craters on the moon are named after Jesuits. 36. It's extraordinary the number of Jesuit astronomers there are. Jesuits have been engaged with the latest and best science, and always have been right the way through. So people like Matteo Ricci went to China, and before he did any preaching, he tried to understand the culture in which he's operating. All the time, the Jesuits have been aware of the culture in which they're operating and have tried to respond to that. And that's what I want to reflect on this afternoon. I want to try and look at the culture where we are today, and I want to try and see what lessons there may be from this. You've heard from Brendan Callaghan something of the history of Heythrop, and I'm not going to go through that again. The 17th century was dangerous times to be Catholic, and very sensibly, the Heythrop as we know it today, albeit with a different name, was in Belgium, at one time at least, Louvain, Liège, and eventually came to Stonyhurst. 1926, it moved to the wonderful building which is now home to National Westminster before it sold it to a golf course in Oxford. It was a seminary up till 1926, the Jesuits, but numbers of Jesuits were declining, and they opened the doors to people from other religious orders. We've heard about that briefly. But what was even more extraordinary was what they did at the end of the 1960s. I knew Heythrop well before I knew anything about this Heythrop. I think I was the first person to land a helicopter on the grounds of the old Heythrop, because between 1976 and 1982, I went there 10 times a year, because I was lecturing to the senior managers at National Westminster Bank. And I remember one dinner I went to there, hosted by the person in charge of the international division of the National Westminster Bank. There were 20 senior managers across the world, and me. It was the finest dinner I've ever had in my life. There were 7 courses. The wines were absolutely extraordinary. I've never tasted anything like them since. And I can't remember whether it was behind every 2 or 3 people there was a liveried footman. And the chairman of the international division talked a bit about the history of the building and said, this is where the Jesuits were. And I obviously thought, wow, what a magnificent place to study. Wow, what a magnificent cellar they must have had. It was only later that I learned that National Westminster Bank had to spend as much on making the place waterproof and doing it up as they actually spent on buying the place. And the place, as I knew it, was very different from the 1960s. So numbers are declining. Cost of running the place is very high. It's a very large place, really not fit for purpose. The Jesuits recognized the signs of the times. Fair enough. Nothing particularly odd about that. What was odd was the extraordinary decision to make it part of the University of London. And if anything, there is a tension that's running all the way through the recent history of Heythrop as to whether it is going to be a Catholic college controlled by the bishops or it is going to be a full college with academic independence. And some of the questions have brought that out. And the Jesuits at the time said Heythrop is going to be a full college of the University of London, with all that means in terms of academic freedom. John put it very well this morning when he made the distinction between de jure and de facto. And that distinction worked very well, and the fact that the Cardinal couldn't understand it is part, I'm afraid, of a wider perception that sometimes occurs in Rome. I think it's very sad. I think it's more than sad, because the Catholic identity has been very clear, but it is not a juridical identity. It is a separate college of the University of London with all that means in terms of total academic freedom, and all that means of an inability of bishops to interfere in academic freedom, and that has been part of the character and charism of the college, and it's one of the reasons that has made it so very, very special. So, full college of the University of London, and you've heard a bit of the history. Started with the BD, welcomed, by the way, of the other colleges of the University of London, particularly King's and the non-conformist colleges, and through the 1980s this expanded, first into the BA in philosophy, and then into an increasing range of postgraduate degrees. Marie Gren was recognising the sign of the times. People wanted to study the subjects you could study at Heythrop, but they didn't have time to do it full time. So an increasing range through the late 1980s and 1990s of postgraduate degrees taught in the evening. And that provided an extraordinary opportunity for mature people who wanted to reflect on philosophy, theology, psychology, and related disciplines to actually acquire high levels of academic skill, and yet to do so in the evenings, again responding to the sign of the times. So Heythrop, now a full college of the University of London, and expanding its provision outside just undergraduates, obviously extending into postgraduates in terms of research degrees, but with master's degrees increasingly important. John McDade is an extraordinary guy. I have a huge regard for him in many ways, but one of the particular instances that I want to mention is after the tube bombing in London. John was in the carriage behind where the bomb took place. And I was the first person to meet him when he came in that morning. You would have expected him to be shocked and shaken, maybe angry. He was not. He was completely relaxed. But what he said right the moment he entered the door, the moment I met him, we have got to introduce something like what became the BA in Abrahamic religions. We've got to bring together Muslims, Christians, and Jews studying together. That was his reaction. And of course, we launched the BA in Abrahamic religions, bringing together Muslims, Christians, and Jews. One of my many fond memories is of bringing Mohammed Shamali over from Qum in Iran. Qum, one of the major centres of theological education in the Islamic world. And we were very tight on space. And he had to share an office with Jonathan Gorski, a Jewish rabbi. Not many places in the world where you've got an Orthodox Jew sharing an office with a professor from Qum. But what struck me most, and some of my colleagues, was the wonderful human beings they both were. They came from very different traditions, but there was something about being human that they both had. And it was John's vision that enabled that to be possible. Again, it was reading the signs of the times. And that influence of Heythrop spread. I run conferences across the country. I'm off to Australia next week, but I'm constantly amazed by how many heads of department either have degrees from Heythrop or have been taught by people who have degrees from Heythrop. It has spread extraordinarily, exponentially, in fact. So we arrived at the present site, and it is now closing. We live in a post-truth world. You all know about President Trump. Oxford University declared post-truth as the word of the year in 2016. The power of the media, the power of their owners, the proliferation of the web and multiple news outlets, each with their own agenda, the decline in truth is not surprising. But it is really quite extraordinary. There's something called confirmation bias. We tend to read what will suit our best interests or what we like to read. If you read The Guardian, if you read the Daily Telegraph, if you read the Times, if you read, God forbid, the Daily Mail, you are reading something that will reinforce your preconceptions. But nowhere is this more the case than in the United States, where something like Fox News is apparently almost the only thing that Trump watches and has a particular agenda. And of course, he would accuse CNN and other providers of having other agendas. The media has exploded, and it was meant to provide much greater access to news and resources. The trouble is, anybody can post. And how does one differentiate between what is true and what is false? Indeed, do those words make any sense? So how did we come to this situation? How do we come at the beginning of the 21st century to be talking of post-truth? I think maybe you could obviously go back to ancient atheists, Middle Ages, maybe David Hume, but possibly the 19th century, the most influential. People like Comte, Feuerbach, Darwin, Nietzsche, Durkheim, Schopenhauer, Marx, Freud. There were many figures who were basically saying the whole idea of religion is irrelevant. But that was something that was taken on board maybe in academic circles, certainly in France, but not really among the general population. What I think changed was the First World War. The slaughter of the First World War, the slaughter of the Somme and Passchendaele. How could you any longer hold on to the idea of God, of meaning, of beauty, of value, when you see 200,000 dying like cattle, no, like cockroaches in the trenches of the Somme? And of course this gave rise to artists like the Dadaists, Marcel Duchamp with his Fountain, Gens Urinal, still with a stock number there, one of the most important pieces of work owned by the Metropolitan Museum of Modern Art. And the Dadaists basically produced art based on photomontages of bus tickets or refuse. There is no meaning. There is no truth. These words have now been discredited. And again, as we go through the 20th century, we get new philosophic movements emerging, mirrored by movements of art. Expressionism, emotivism, obviously existentialism. Jean-Paul Sartre, we've got to live in a world devoid of meaning. Echoes maybe of Nietzsche. We've got to say yes to live in the meaningless universe. And culminating in postmodernism. I find it very difficult to define what on earth postmodernism is. There seem to be so many postmodernists and so many postmodernisms. I sometimes think academics delight in inventing new words so that they can get cited more often. Increasingly, academic work seems not to be engaged with the search for truth, but the search for citations. That's, after all, what generates money. So we live in a postmodern world. There is no meta-narrative. There is no single truth. And that is widely accepted by many people, and all of this has contributed to a post-truth world. Matthew Arnold's poem sums up the position well. The sea of faith was once two at the full, and round earth's shore lay like the folds of a bright girdle furled. But now I only hear its melancholy, long withdrawing roar, retreating to the breath of the night wind, down the vast edges drear and naked shingles of the world. It's a sad poem. But in many ways, we live in a post-Christian culture. I think somebody said earlier, people are bored with Christianity. They think they know what it is. They don't, of course, but they're bored. They prefer, if they're young, to study Islam or Buddhism. At least it's new. And for many young people, they're completely relativists. If you want to be Wicca, if you want to be a Jedi, if you want to support Arsenal, if you want to be a Catholic, just don't kick the cat. They're all multiple narratives, everyone as valid as every other. It's a persuasive position. The closure of Heythrop was inevitable. There was no way it could be avoided. There were various factors at work. Increasingly see the power of the administrators increasing. And the administrators are at work in hospitals, they're at work in schools, they're at work in the police force, they're at work in universities. I'm not blaming the administrators, but increasingly measurement is what is most important. More and more emphasis on measurement, on achievement, marked, of course, in terms of citations, and that means an administrative burden. And Heythrop simply wasn't big enough to bear the administrative burden of being a separate university college. Just over 1,000 students, not viable. You'd have to have at least 7,000 or 8,000, and even that would be stretching it. Then, of course, there's a decline in the number of Jesuits, and fewer of those actually wanted to become academics. And the society was incredibly generous in providing the services of the Jesuits at no cost, or later at very little cost. To replace them with salaried staff, simply not feasible. But then there is a widespread indifference to truth and the rise of relativism. And I'm afraid we see this at work, particularly in education. Religious education is something I know a fair amount about. And the developments of the last 2 or 3 years have been simply disastrous. Heythrop was at the centre of trying to promote religious education in schools. We did it by pushing things that young people would be interested in, particularly in philosophy of religion and ethics. Don't let anybody tell you that young people are not interested in God. They are. They're interested in God, they're interested in meaning, they're interested in evil, they're interested in atheism, they're interested in omnipotence and omniscience, they're interested in ethics. Is there a distinction between good and evil? They're interested in just war, they're interested in genetic engineering, they're interested in abortion, they're interested in the ethics of sex, they're interested. And we had explosive growth in religious and values education at GCSE and A-level, which went on for about 20 years. And Heythrop made a major contribution to that. And it all changed with the new specifications that were introduced a couple of years ago. Number one, the amount of material that has to be covered at GCSE is completely ridiculous. It is a huge amount of material. And for those of you who are teachers, you will know the formidable difficulty of getting through it. But also, some interest groups, I think particularly maybe the bishops, both Anglican and Catholic, wanted a more Christian approach to be taken. So we had more theology introduced. I once remember John McDade saying, you shouldn't be doing theology till you're over 30. And I think he was dead right. I think there is wisdom in this. And yet we've got 14-year-olds meant to be studying the atonement, redemption, salvation, and original sin, and about 20 minutes for each one. You just can't do it. And people end up thinking it's Mickey Mouse. And I have to say, I don't blame them. If you're going to deal with these complex issues, you need time. You need time to reflect. And the new specifications are simply mammoth. And the result is people are not choosing to go on to A-levels. I was running a conference at one of the biggest Catholic sixth forms in the country. Over 3,000 students. And 2 years ago, they had 250 people out of the 3,000 studying A-level religious studies. Next year, they will have 90. And across the country, I find departments are closing or reducing because of numbers. Sometimes heads are doing it to save cost. Cost, after all, is the new god in many parts of education. Often it's done more subtly. RS is not part of the English baccalaureate, and therefore heads will put it in an option block, and people can choose. But when very few people choose, they say, well, I'm sorry, the demand is not there. And that trend is going to continue. So even if Heythrop had continued, the number of people coming forward would have been much reduced. You might say that's a bleak picture. Well, I would recommend strongly, if you haven't read it, that you read a document in the name of John Paul II, possibly written by Benedict as Cardinal Ratzinger, called Fides et Ratio. It is a brilliant history of philosophy. It is a quite extraordinary document, written in 1998. And it bemoans relativism, it bemoans postmodernism and nihilism. It's brilliant. And it basically says philosophy has lost its way. It's no longer preoccupied with the great questions that we at Heythrop were interested in. The ones the Pope listed were, who am I? Where have I come from and where am I going? Why is there evil? What is there after this life? And the answer may be nothing, but they are important questions. They were the questions the Greeks were after. And I want to quote some extracts from that, because the document is a passionate appeal for the importance of philosophy. Philosophy and theology have always been handmaids in the Catholic tradition. But this is Pope John Paul II saying philosophy is absolutely central. The search for wisdom through reason is one of the noblest tasks that a human being can undertake. I quote, philosophy shows in different modes and forms that the desire for truth is part of human nature itself. Without wonder, men and women would lapse into a deadening routine and little by little would become incapable of a life which is genuinely personal. Look at the amount of time spent on the smartphones. And you're as guilty of it as many of our young people. We're so preoccupied with the smartphones, very little time to contemplate the beauty of the hawthorn. The principle of non-contradiction, finality and causality, as well as the concept of the person as a free and intelligent subject, are ignored. And this has given rise, I'm quoting again, to different forms of agnosticism and relativism, which have led philosophic research to lose its way in the shifting sands of widespread skepticism. Recent times have seen the rise to prominence of various doctrines which tend to devalue even truths which had been judged certain. A legitimate plurality of positions, I repeat, a legitimate plurality of positions has yielded to an undifferentiated pluralism based on the assumption that all positions are equally valid, which is one of today's most widespread symptoms of the lack of confidence in truth. Everything is reduced to opinion. 1998, Trump, post-truth. People rest content, I'm still quoted, with partial and provisional truths, no longer seeking to ask radical questions about the meaning and ultimate foundation of human personal and social existence. With its enduring appeal to the search for truth, philosophy has the responsibility of forming thought and culture, and it must strive resolutely to recover its original foundation. The Pope actually says there is no Catholic philosophy. What the document wanted was philosophy pursuing the great questions, that there was something called truth to be sought. And I think Heythrop was committed to that. There was something called truth to be sought. We may not be able to achieve it, but there was something to be sought. The document seeks to re-establish the central place of philosophy as a search for wisdom. The Pope says a positivist mentality took hold which not only abandoned the Christian vision of the world, but more especially rejected every appeal to a metaphysical or moral vision. The document traces the whole history of philosophy. It's brilliant. And this, of course, is Schlick and the logical positivists. It follows that certain scientists, lacking any ethical point of reference, are in danger of putting at the centre of their concerns something other than the human person. And the Greeks were interested in that. As a result of this crisis of rationalism, what has finally appeared is nihilism. And that is the situation that many of our young people are in at the moment. They believe in nothing except being happy without actually thinking what that means. Nihilism, the Pope says, has a certain attraction. Its adherents claim the search is at an end without any hope or possibility of attaining the goal of truth. Life is no more than an occasion for sensations and experiences in which the ephemeral has pride of place. Plato would have recognized this. Nihilism is at the root of the widespread mentality which claims that a definitive commitment should no longer be made because everything is fleeting and provisional. Heythrop stood against that. Heythrop sought truth, and that is an unfashionable idea. Last quote. It is necessary not to abandon the passion for ultimate truth, the eagerness to search for it, or the audacity to forge new paths in its search. It is faith which stirs reason to move beyond isolation, and willing to run risks so that it may attain whatever is beautiful, good, and true. Faith becomes the convincing advocate of reason. Faith is the faith that there is something called truth, that the post-truth idea is a passing thing, although I don't agree with John that we are not in a post-truth world. I think we are. I think we're in a post-truth world up to our necks, and it is very, very difficult to talk against it. In next week's issue of America, the Jesuit Journal in the States, they say that Benedict predicted the rise of Trump. Benedict, during his papacy, in the early days of his papacy, said, the growing relativism that does not recognize anything as definitive and whose ultimate concern consists solely of one's own ego and desires. The Journal America, in an article coming out next week, basically says that's Trump. There's a dictatorship of relativism, Benedict says. So I wish I agreed with John that we're not in a post-truth world. I don't think he's right. These are the signs of the times. These are the world we have to live in. You would expect it that faced with this, there would be a degree of unity, that the religious perspective would be united in trying to speak into this relativism, nihilism, postmodern, whatever you like to call it, world. But the reverse is the case. What we find is religious groups that turn on themselves, religious groups that are much more interested in fighting within themselves. In Judaism, the tension between Reform Judaism and more conservative elements with infinite varieties in between. In Hinduism, the same is applying. In Islam, it's not just Sunni and Shia, it's Salafist, Wahhabi, and many, many other different versions. We see what's happening in what used to be Burma, where effectively you've got Muslims being oppressed. What about in Christianity? In Anglicanism, it's being torn apart on the issue of homosexuality and women priests. Lutheranism has the same sort of problems. And what about the Catholic tradition? Oh, well, clear. The Catholic tradition knows what it stands for. No division there. You must be joking. I have one sadness and one possible criticism, and that is I do regret that the Jesuits did not decide to fund, out of the very considerable profit they would make on the sale of this site, an external degree in theology which could have been made available worldwide. It would have cost very little, and there are outstanding teachers of Heythrop that could have led that, and it would have been a wonderful initiative. Open-minded, maybe as part of the University of London, not necessarily, but actually making that provision available to people in prisons, to people who are poor. All the technology is there. It would have been easy to do. I wrote an article in the Tablet 5 years ago advocating this. No one was interested. I'm not at all sure how much consultation is taking place between bishops and ordinary people. I'm not at all sure how many clergy are making use of the talents of the many people who have master's degrees from Heythrop. I hear stories of people coming up with a master's degree in theology being marginalised because they're women. I worry that the Church does not recognise the situation we're facing. I'm not sure, as I say, how much consultation is taking place. And nowhere is the reaction to Fides et Ratio and the signs of the times more apparent that in some of the reaction to Pope Francis's 2016 encyclical Amoris Laetitia. If you haven't read it, can I strongly recommend it? It's an extraordinary document. But it's called forth a very vitriolic response from some quarters of the Catholic Church, because Pope Francis seems to be moving the goalposts. My own view is that he's faithful to Aquinas. He claims to be faithful to Aquinas. And Derry Hughes says he's faithful to Aquinas. And for my mind, I can have no higher imprimatur than that. Pope Francis says, God is not a wizard with a magic wand. Christianity and scientific theories about the origin of the world are compatible. I accept the theory of evolution and the Big Bang. People with hate in their hearts mock God. They don't understand that God is nothing than love. We must meet one another doing good. But Father, I don't believe in God. I'm an atheist. Do good. We will meet one another there. He's reaching out and trying to show the relevance of the Christian tradition across boundaries. There has always been tension since the Vatican Council, but going back to Newman and before, about conscience. To what extent is conscience obeying what the Church says? And that is completely wrong to say that the Church says, obey because we say so. Aquinas says conscience is reason making right decisions. Reason working out what it is to be fully human. And the faithful Catholic, in obeying the teaching of the Church, is not saying, I will obey because you're saying so, but is basically saying, who is more likely to get it right? Me caught up with my own emotions in limited knowledge, or the teaching of 2,000 years of history. And there is no tension, therefore, between individual conscience in assenting to the teaching of the Church and rationality. But Pope Francis seems to be moving the goalposts, because many Catholics will say, obey the rules. What it is to be a good Catholic, go to Mass every week and obey the rules. And Pope Francis begins to say, it's more complicated. Let me quote. We find it hard, this is not me, this is Pope Francis, to make room for the consciousness of the faithful, who very often respond as best they can to the gospel amid their limitations, and are capable of carrying out their own discernment in complex situations. We have been called to form consciences, not to replace them. And some Catholics don't like this. They feel it undermines the absolute moral rules. Again, from Francis, by thinking everything is black and white, we close off the way of grace and growth and discourage paths of sanctification which give glory to God. It is reductive simply to consider whether or not an individual's actions correspond to a general rule. That is not enough to discern and ensure fidelity to God in the concrete life of a human being. Pope Francis resonates outside the Catholic Church and with many within it, but not all. Professor John Finnis at the University of Oxford is one who has no time for Francis at all. But there are cardinals, there are bishops who also have no time for him. He's written a letter requiring clarification, a polite word, of Amoris Laetitia. It represents a thinly veiled challenge to the Pope's position. 4 cardinals and a number of bishops have done the same. Accusing the Pope of heresy is not new. At the beginning of the 14th century, a student of Aquinas became Pope and was accused of heresy by the theology faculty of the University of Paris. It is not new. But you may have heard of Cardinal Raymond Burke. He's one of 4 cardinals who have asked the Pope to clarify Amoris Laetitia. It is not possible, I'm quoting from the Cardinal, to receive the sacraments for a person who is living with someone who is not his or her spouse. To claim instead that this is possibility constitutes a formal error that goes against what Jesus himself taught and has always been the teaching of the Church. This is what the Church teaches. Francis, you're going against it. And he says 4 cardinals, at least 30 bishops, have agreed with him. So instead of the Church turning and challenging a postmodern relativistic culture, what we have is internal divisions. Put that together with the publicity given to child abuse and other things, and it is not surprising we have the problems we do. Pope Francis chastises those who attack him, to say it's always been done like this. They shut off and resist the Holy Spirit. This is Pope Francis. From the time of the prophets until now, the sin to resist the Holy Spirit has always been there. This resistance of the Spirit, this is the sin which Stephen accuses the members of the Sanhedrin. You and our fathers have always resisted the Holy Spirit. It's always been done this way and must be done so. They tell Peter not to bring this newness, to remain calm. Take a tranquilizer and calm the nerves. This is Francis, not me. So the voice of God is shut out. Instead of focusing on the challenge of our times, we have people turning in on ourselves. And I wonder, and I have no idea, this is only the first time I've been back to Heythrop since I left some years ago, but I wonder to what extent there are forces who didn't like Heythrop because it was dedicated to open-minded philosophy and theology at its very best. There are voices in Rome which felt that was the case, and I think it's a tragedy. I think it's short-sighted, and I think it's a denial of what good education, Jesuit education, is actually being about. The current general of the Jesuits, Arturo Sousa Abascal, forgive me if the pronunciation is wrong, has been accused of heresy. I'm not sure if you're aware of this, because he has said that the words of Jesus need to be interpreted. There was no tape recorder at the time of Jesus. Why? Because when it says, what God has joined together, let no man put asunder, we've got to look at that. We've got to interpret it. Rejected charges of relativizing the words of Jesus, the Superior General of the Worldwide Jesuit Order stood by his insistence that no one was tape recording Christ. I don't know why so many people get mad at me for what I said, which is that in the time of Jesus there were no tape recorders. It's the truth. We have to interpret. Biblical fundamentalists are dangerous. Fundamentalists in Islam who just rely on a text are dangerous. Once you just rely on a text, you no longer look at complexity. And one of the tragedies is the decline in biblical studies. We've got fewer and fewer people actually studying the Bible in depth, and therefore young people grow up thinking, well, either 9 years old, Darwin is true, or creation stories is true. And it's not surprising they switch off. Patrick Conroy is the forced to resign as trapped into the House of Representatives by the Republican Speaker Paul Ryan, partly, apparently, due to the following prayer. May their efforts these days guarantee that there are not winners and losers under new tax laws. The Republican leader didn't like it. He's now withdrawn his resignation, I'm delighted to say, and hopefully will continue in office. And then somebody else was saying, oh, we need a married chaplain. Maybe it's some anti-Catholic bias. More than 150 bishops, priests and academics have launched statements in support of Pope Francis. It is wonderful to see the former vice principal of Heythrop amongst their number. They say, your pastoral initiatives and their theological justification are currently under vehement attack by a group in the church. With this open letter, we want to express our gratitude for your courageous and theologically sound leadership. They congratulate the Pope on reshaping the pastoral culture of the church, adding, we share your dream. But instead of being concerned with speaking into the culture of our time, I think people are preoccupied with these struggles. What made Heythrop special? Why do we care about it so much? Was it the library? I don't actually think so. In my experience, most students didn't even read a third of the books on the reading list, and we'd probably be lucky to get to that many. It'd be nice if they did, but they didn't. High academic standards, you could say the same for many other institutions. Small class sizes, they were getting bigger in the later days, not that much bigger than many other universities. I don't think it's any of those. I think it's something else. I think Heythrop was a deeply human place. It was a place where teachers cared for and about students. We've heard from John McDade and Brendan. They were busy principals of a University of London college, which all that meant. But they still had time and commitment to teaching, and to teaching the weaker students. It is very, very few places where you find the top academics teaching first-year undergraduates. We had that at Heythrop. We had staff across the board who cared for students. They cared for their disciplines, they cared for truth, but they also cared deeply about their students. And I think that is what makes Heythrop special. The person who's influenced me most is Søren Kierkegaard, the Lutheran in 19th century Denmark, who Wittgenstein described as the greatest theologian in the 19th century and a saint. I ran for 25 years a course here, and I was very lucky to do so. But he differentiates between direct and indirect communication. Direct communication is what I'm doing to you, talking at you. When you read a book, that's direct communication. Indirect communication is something else. It is showing somebody something. And that is not easy. It's not easy to show somebody something. Staff at Heythrop cared. They cared about what it was to be human. I'm a philosopher, and two people who I admire greatly are Jerry Hughes and Peter Gallagher. They were both very, very able and good philosophers. Their ability to spot a dodgy argument at 100 paces was outstanding. But they were also deeply good human beings. I remember shortly after I joined Heythrop, my first book, somebody suggested I take it to ask Freddie Coppleston at Farm Street, who had retired, if I'd take it to him for a recommendation. I was terrified. I mean, this is a guy who was absolutely formidable. People used to say the trouble with Coppleston was you couldn't tell whether a student had read Coppleston or read the original. And I went along in fear and trepidation. What I found was a wonderful, gentle, kind, compassionate person. And it is that quality, I think, that we found in a lot of staff at Heythrop. C.S. Lewis said, we castrate and build the geldings be fruitful. I think what we need to do is to recognise that we have a huge debt to Heythrop, not just because of what it taught us, because of the people who were here. Not just the staff, but also the students. We shared together a wish to try to understand, because these issues mattered. It wasn't just an academic subject. A head teacher in the US who'd been through the Holocaust, wrote to his staff, and if you'll forgive me, I will like to quote his letter. Dear teacher, I'm a survivor of a concentration camp. My eyes saw what no person should witness. Gas chambers built by learned engineers. Children poisoned by educated physicians. Infants killed by trained nurses. Women and babies shot and burned by high school and college graduates. I am suspicious of education. My request is help your students to become more human. Your efforts must never produce learned monsters, skilled psychopaths, educated Eichmanns. Reading, writing, and arithmetic are important only if they serve to make our children more human. I think deep down that is what Heythrop recognised. It was about what it means to be human, and all the different subjects were contributing to answer that question. Beneath everything else, that's what made this place so special. Today, we've got an emphasis on results. People are being tested as young as 7 years old. And that doesn't give the ability for a human interaction. Go back to the idea of love, just briefly. Many young people are growing up in loveless households. How do you communicate what love is? They're going to get involved in sex, in a hope for love at 12 or 13. Do you lecture to them? Do you run a PHSE course for them? Do you give them a book to read? No. You've got to show they're loved, they're cared for. And that means teachers who actually care for the children. A head teacher in Australia, probably the finest head teacher I know, called John Inverarity. He's chairman of the selectors. He was a former Australia cricketer. And he said, when I'm looking for teachers, I look for somebody who is a good human being and someone who loves children. Now, of course, you can't say love children these days because it's got negative connotations. But I knew what he meant. He cared. And I think that's what Heythrop did. I think our teachers cared, and I think we tended to care for each other. The flame that has been Heythrop, that has nourished so many of us, has died. The fire is out. It remains for us to pick up the embers, because fires leave behind flickering embers. And from embers, new fires can be lit. They may be small, but we have a responsibility. It's not enough to say, oh, well, I enjoyed my time at Heythrop. It is better to light a candle than curse the darkness. And that is what the memory of Heythrop calls us to do. We've been given a gift of this place, and we owe it an enormous amount. And the way of repaying that gift is to try to pass it on, to try to show to younger people, to others, to people that we mix, that issues of truth, issues of meaning, issues of compassion, love, matter, that being human matters. John McGlade asked for the last word from Heythrop. My last word would be, pass it on. Pass it on.